Evening. My name is Simon Hodson. I'm
That's
Executive
good.
Director
I hear
of
it.
CODATA, and I'm very grateful to Claire and to Rajni for the opportunity to speak to this working group meeting at the RDA plenary. I've been invited to address this group because there has been a proposal, which I understand has been in principle accepted by the co-chairs and by RDA, that this working group should be co-branded RDA CODATA. That should happen in order to encourage cooperation and collaboration between aligned activities under RDA and in this working group, and activities which are already underway under the CODATA decadal program, Making Data Work for Cross-Domain Grand Challenges. So I'm going to give a short presentation about that program, and hopefully through that you'll see how we hope that this working group can contribute, as well as contributing to RDA activities and the mission of this working group, can also contribute and be part of the CODATA-sponsored activity. CODATA is the Committee on Data of the International Science Council. The International Science Council is a membership body which represents science globally and can genuinely claim to be the global voice of science. Just going to close my camera so you can focus on the presentation itself. CODATA is the Committee on Data of the International Science Council, but we're not just a committee, we're a membership organisation in our own right, and we pursue a suite of activities including policy in data science and promoting and overseeing task groups and working groups, and this global programme which is in preparation and parts of which are underway, as you'll see. So the premise of this activity, of this global programme, Making Data Work for Cross-Domain Grand Challenges, is that the pressing global and scientific and human issues of the 21st century can only be addressed through research that works across domains to understand complex systems, and which use a transdisciplinary approach to turn data into knowledge and then into action. When I talk there about major scientific and human issues, I'm thinking about climate change reduction or mitigation and adaptation, disaster risk reduction, the growth of cities, etc., etc. Now, each of these challenges share common features in that they require a cross-domain approach. They require data from many, many different sources, and they share challenges in terms of the accessibility, the interoperability and the reusability of those data. And it's those issues, closely related of course to the FAIR principles, that we want to address through this global program. There's a very significant reason for this, for the International Science Council and CODATA's interest in these challenges. For the last 20 years or so, the International Science Council has sponsored a series of global coordinating scientific programs precisely to address these global challenges. Future Earth, for example, on global sustainability, climate change, mitigation and adaptation, integrated research on disaster risk for disaster risk reduction, and the program on urban health and well-being, as well as taking an interest in issues such as the Sendai Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. So a significant motivation behind the decadal program is to help address some of the very significant data issues that those programs and related activities are encountering. So we've been asked by the International Science Council to prepare the program, and we've been working on that for the last 2 years and developing some pilot initiatives, which I'll talk about now. In terms of the program design, we've identified 3 broad work areas. I'll start with number 2. We want to work with particular domains. We are working with particular domains on the issues faced in terms of data by specific domains and encouraging the adoption of specifications and standards to increase interoperability and reusability of data, to adopt the FAIR principles, if you like. We're also developing case studies on particular cross-domain research areas, and in particular those that I've already mentioned. And then the first box there at the top of that triangle, this approach to how we address those challenges, which includes consensus and technical solutions for data interoperability and promoting, of course, terminologies, ontologies, metadata, and the application of machine learning where possible. So a program of technical and consensus building activities for interoperability. So how do we apply that, and what have we got to, what progress have we made so far in the pilot stage of this initiative? So I'm going to very briefly run through some of the activities which are already underway. So this first slide covers some of the technically focused groups. CODATA has a task group on digital representation of units of measure, and of course addressing the way units are described, presented, represented, and referenced is essential to interoperability. There's also a suite of activities, of pilot activities, as part of the program on semantic interoperability and a conceptual framework for that. And this includes the representation, the governance and sustainability of vocabularies and other semantic resources. We've also developed a very good collaboration with the Data Documentation Initiative, and we're doing work in partnership with DDI to explore, promote, and further refine the draft DDI cross-domain integration specification, which will become finalized early next year. And that includes an EOSC-funded co-creation project, which is looking at what that specification, DDI, CDI, can do for EOSC, and in particular for the research infrastructures and the EOSC clusters, which look at cross-domain research areas and therefore cross-domain data integration. We're also working with a number of cross-domain case studies, policy monitoring indicators, addressing issues of the UN agenda, the SDGs, and the Sendai framework, which I've already mentioned. There's activity on infectious diseases, which is most relevant to this working group session, in which Arafan will speak about more in his presentation. And there's also a large collaborative group on resilient healthy cities, with which we're partnering with the ISC program on resilient and healthy cities, and as part of that, identifying shared themes, theoretical and technical approaches to combining data for the issues faced by the growing cities in the 21st century. And then we have a set of activities which I'll call collaboration initiatives, a CAS, that's Chinese Academy of Sciences funded project, to encourage collaboration between open science cloud or platform initiatives. And that's a 5-year CAS-funded project which will encourage cooperation between a number of initiatives globally in terms of policies, in terms of data infrastructure, and in terms of interoperability. And of course, collaboration with the GoFair initiative and with RDA and the World Data System under this umbrella of Data Together, which you may have heard about, and there's information on all our websites about that collaboration. In 3 weeks' time, there will be the FAIR Convergence Symposium, and if you're interested in attending that, you can find out a lot more about those activities which I've already mentioned. Please take notes of the program and how to register, but all through that week, there'll be a lot of sessions relating very closely and very much about the initiatives which are already underway that I've mentioned. So I've described this as a pilot stage. In the last 2 years, we've held a series of workshops and we've generated a certain amount of activity relating to the decadal program, and we're now transitioning from that pilot stage of activity to the decadal program proper. In the last 2 weeks, we've held a series of workshops at the Darkstrahl Center, the Leibniz Foundation's Darkstrahl Center in Germany, and the planning group for that has been very much very much involved in designing the decadal program, working with the CODATA Secretariat and generating the set of initial pilots, projects and working groups. We're now developing into the decadal program proper, for which we'll appoint a governing council, which will provide high-level oversight on our relationship with the International Science Council, Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, which will play a key advisory role, and which is to be appointed in early 2021. And then as key elements of the decadal program, on the one hand, a distributed technical office, a cohort of experts globally, which will provide technical input and guidance, and of course the distributed secretariat, offices or officers contributed by partner institutions and from the CODATA Secretariat itself. Those bodies will relate to a series of program officers, projects and working groups which will participate in the decadal program. That will be according to simple rules of engagement, and it can include partner projects with third-party funds, for example, contributions from program partners, voluntary working groups, as well as any projects funded directly from program resources. So we hope that that will include projects with their own funding that feel that it's advantageous to participate in the decadal program. It can include working groups such as this one, whose work aligns with and contributes to the overall vision of the decadal program, or, as I say, the existing projects and working groups that we're working with, which may be able to generate their own funding, or may be able to access funding that we generate from the program as such. So that's the vision of what we need to put in place in the coming year or two, and this slide gives another overview of that, but really throws out that invitation to this working group and to others to participate in this activity, which we hope, as well as coming under the CODATA banner and the ISC banner, will also be considered very much a data together activity. Our objective for 2021 is for there to be a formal launch and the appointment of that governing body, as well as some of those other elements in that the diagram I just showed, in time for the International Science Council's General Assembly, which will take place in Oman in October 21. We hope that by that time people will be able to travel to that. So thank you very much for your attention. That was a brief overview of the activities which we have underway so far and the vision of the decadal program, Making Data Work for Cross-Domain Grand Challenges. And we'll hear more from Arifan later, as I indicated, of some of the work that we've been engaged with in the infectious disease area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. We'll go straight to Arifan's presentation, and then we'll have a discussion on the two talks. Arifan, we have your slides up. Do you want Rajini to control them, or do you want to share your screen?
Let me try to share my screen, Claire. Let's see how that works.
All right.
So I don't know if you're seeing that now. I probably want to start.
Not yet. There's a bit of a delay.
This. Okay, and sometimes it takes a minute. Okay, can you see the presentation now? Oh dear, what happened?
It says you've started sharing.
Okay, I'm not sure what I'm looking at because my mouse doesn't work anymore. Resume slideshow. How do I get there? Oh, that's interesting. Let me see. No. I don't quite know how to get this to the display.
Oh, there you go.
That's very, very interesting.
We've got it now.
It's going to kick out in a minute, though. Maybe it's acting
No, I
very,
see
very
your
strange on my
slides
side
now,
here.
Arafan.
Okay, well, I'm just going to try. Wow, I'm something
Arafan, we
completely
see your
different than you
slides
are.
now.
That's very interesting. Well, okay. Are they in display mode?
No, it's not full screen though.
Okay, let me go back there. Okay, is that full screen now?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll try to do this. I've already been introduced, and I'm giving this sort of on behalf of. I'm a participant in the Inspire project, which is one of the activities that Simon just talked about, which is really one of their domain use cases that's leading into the Decadal program. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what Inspire is doing, give you a little bit of a technical overview, because I think now that the work that's being proposed around a surveillance standard is CODATA is going to be a partner in this work. I think it's interesting to understand what Inspire can potentially bring to the party, as it were. And I'm involved in that program on behalf of CODATA, as are a couple of other people. What I'm going to be talking about is a little bit of background about where Inspire comes from and what it is, where it's going, and why that's, I think, makes it very relevant to this group. Talk a little bit about the technical design with an emphasis on the data and metadata models and how they fit in, because there's a number of them. And I think that that is important for how we look at a reporting standard for surveillance. Honestly, look a little bit at some of the COVID related factors that we have sort of made an appearance in the Inspire world, and the sort of considerations that follow on that, and then conclusions. So I think a quick presentation. People may be aware in I think it started in the 60s and certainly in the 70s, there came into existence health and demographic surveillance sites, or sentinel sites. And they, at a certain point, banded together and created a thing called the in-depth network. And these are sites that are collecting data in countries that don't conduct census or other sort of broad-based longitudinal studies. And there was a big gap in the data in the LMIC countries. And so in-depth is today a network of 49 HDSS sites worldwide, and they're in 3 different continents. And in-depth was basically a data sharing arrangement between these sites so that people could access the data being collected in different places. The network grew over time. It got quite large. I think there are 42 dedicated research centers as feeding off of those 49 HDSS sites. But in some sense, it's a little limited because it's very much a network of give us what you have and we'll share it. And it's not a situation where there are lots of standards or requirements for the data or metadata. And that actually puts a limitation on the usability of the data. It's not always comparable, for instance, and that has been a problem. Because of that, there was a woman at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine who'd been very involved with in-depth, and she had an idea that if you took a narrower focus, in this case HIV research, and took some of the better disciplined HDSS sites, you could have you could produce a higher value research product in terms of having harmonized data. And so she set up what is today the Alpha Network. It's a Wellcome Trust funded project involving 10 HDSS sites in Eastern and Southern Africa, and it's coordinated out of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It is looking at HIV data not coming from the clinics, but coming from the field. And the reason that's important in Africa is because a lot of people don't go to clinics because there aren't enough of them, basically. I'm simplifying that, but what you see is a much more accurate picture of what's going on in those countries as a result of the field work. And so you have a data set that supplements the clinical data. and you can integrate it with the clinical data and get a much more accurate picture of what's going on in Africa around HIV. And this has been quite successful. There's already some pretty interesting research that's come out of that integrated data set. And you can access that if you go to the London School. Now, Inspire happened because CODATA had become aware of Alpha and started working with the Alpha network. And they had an idea that that approach was a good one, and that there was a lot of high value data in the in-depth area and in Alpha particularly, but that approach could be more broadly applied in a more scalable infrastructure. And so Inspire is a small project that is in its initial phase. And there are 16 partners now, 9 of whom are HDSS sites in 4 countries in East Africa. Some of the partners are actually data portal operators and so on in places like South Africa. But it's not a huge project, but it again is focusing only on HIV, but looking at expanding and certainly into the clinical data around HIV and not just sort of demographic and survey data, but also now, as you'll see, COVID-19. And essentially, if I have to summarize what it is in a word, I would say it's a services platform around for data sharing that is an implementation of the OMOP common data model. And we'll come back to that because that's, I think, important. In phase 1, really the goal is to establish a network and to establish the memo of understanding, the governance, and so on. And that's proceeding apace. I think it's largely in place at this point. And to prototype the technical infrastructure. And I'll give you a little more information about that in a minute. And so that work is going to be ongoing through this coming May in 2021. Phase 2 is not yet funded, but we expect it to be. It will be a longer term project and larger. The idea is at that point to establish more sort of network maturity and growth, to spread it out, and to produce a production capable technical infrastructure for data sharing. So to take what's prototyped in phase 1 and make it real, essentially. We are expecting to get money from an IDRC, it's a Canadian funder, doing a data science in Africa program. And it looks very likely that we will be funding, they'll be funding a project expanding this to COVID-19 data. And that's a very interesting project to talk a little bit more about. But the idea here is to take what is a fairly generic infrastructure approach to public health data and to grow it in terms of coverage as aggressively as we can. Now, CODATA has been very involved in the African Open Science Platform. Simon didn't talk about this, but this is a pan-African open science cloud, if you will. It's not called a cloud, but it's one of those kinds of initiatives. And the idea is that they're aligning people across Africa to promote science. And infectious disease was identified as a very high priority area for them, even before COVID hit. And the idea with Inspire is that we could partner with the African Open Science Platform and use them as the basis for collaboration with some of the other African initiatives. As an example of that, there are what they call NRENs, and the one in East Africa is UbuntuNet. What these guys are involved with is providing broadband access and access to computing power for universities and educational institutions for research purposes. And they are really focused on the plumbing, if you will, the pipes and flops, we like to call it. But the idea is that they create a space for research that is sustainable and high bandwidth and needs applications to really leverage. And we see Inspire as being the sort of application that could operate in that kind of an infrastructure framework very effectively. And so we're looking forward to the launch of the African Open Science Platform. They have been in sort of organizing stages for a while. It looks like they're about to become more active. And we're looking forward to collaborating with them and other kinds of initiatives like that in Africa. So we're looking not just at East Africa and Southern Africa, but Pan-Africa. And ultimately, we'd like to see Inspire fit into international collaborations of the kind that you see in RDA and in Data Together with GoFair and the World Data Service as part of the Decadal program. So we're ambitious in terms of what this might become, but we want to start with something that's real. And that's what Inspire is basically doing. The technical design of Inspire is, I think, in some ways, I'm not going to say obvious, but it's straightforward. It's a platform as a service play, if that buzzword means anything to you. And really, the effect of that is that it's a cloud-based infrastructure that will scale very efficiently. And that's perhaps it's an important aspect of it, but maybe the least interesting one. More interesting is the services architecture, I think. And the way we're looking at this, you have a platform, which is a data management platform, essentially, and a services platform based on OMOP for the data and metadata resources, but also giving access to various kinds of services, some of which would be native to the platform, and some of which could be built on top of the platform by external parties. And we use sort of Prov 1 terminology here in terms of what we call off-ramps and on-ramps. These are channels through which people can provide data and metadata to the platform or consume it, so that you have different kinds of on-ramps and off-ramps that would be based on different models. So the core services are based on OMOP, an enhanced OMOP, but on-ramps and off-ramps could be couched in any number of different data models. And this is the picture. So the core hub is the cylinder in the middle, of course. And that is essentially the OMOP common data model with some enhancements for internal management purposes mostly. And OMOP is a very good, it's a very flexible model. It's an extensible model. It's very well suited to dealing with electronic health records, clinical observations, and it's capable of expressing things like demographic data. So it is a pretty good foundational model for the sort of data we're working with. These are example on-ramps, but in the prototype, we're working with the alpha specifications and for HIV data. And so we have an on-ramp there that uses their mechanism for extracting data from the sites and uploading that to the hub. We're also looking at another common standard in Africa called HICDEP, which is again an HIV-related one. But we are anticipating that there will be lots of different on-ramps using different data models. So when we look at clinical data, the IDEA Alliance is a sort of loose network of databases in that area, and we're looking at those sources, trying to figure out whether there is a simple way to collect data from members of the IDEA Alliance. We could see an OMOP-based clinical data system for different kinds of information. You can imagine with COVID-19 that we would be looking at the World Health Organization CRF and VODAN. We might be looking at the Wellcome Trust COVID-19 questionnaire and things like that. So in any given community, there will be standards and data models that will be prevalent. And we can produce on-ramps that accept data described in that form and according to those models, bring them into the hub and transform them into OMOP. Now, that is not as simple as it sounds, but that is bringing them into a common platform makes that a much more tractable problem. On the output side, you can imagine that there would be all kinds of services that could use that data and metadata. I'd like to point out that this is not a data portal. It has a lot in common with a data portal, but it's much more than a catalog because there are services around the data and metadata that a typical portal or catalog does not provide. Some examples again, if you're interested in Google data search, we could advertise data sets in schema.org using, say, a JSON-LD format. We anticipate supporting people using Stata or R or those kinds of packages, using DDI as the documentation model and feeding DDI tools that can do lots of things with data in that type of research environment. For government epidemiology, things like the Sustainable Development Goal indicators and WHO, FAO, they all support SDMX and the sort of semantic equivalent, which is the data cube vocabulary. You could see that being an off-ramp for certain kinds of data based on the Inspire data. You also have a lot of interesting applications like Aegis and Achilles, and there are some other good ones that natively understand OMOP and combine that with other kinds of data. Aegis is nice because it takes GIS data and does some neat mapping with OMOP data. And so these are examples of the kinds of off-ramps that we anticipate. So you can get an idea here that although OMOP is what sits underneath the hub, there would be a whole set of different standards and models in different places. And you can pretty easily see how a reporting standard around surveillance could plug neatly into this as an on-ramp, but potentially also as an off-ramp. So I think that it's important to understand how those kinds of data models fit into the INSPIRE picture. When we look specifically at COVID-19, I think I've already mentioned most of these. You're looking at the VODAN and the WHO CRF, and we became aware of that in the first EPI group in RDA. Jay Greenfield, who was involved in that work, brought this to our attention, and we looked at the mapping of VODAN to the OMOP CDM and saw that that was a doable thing. We have other people in the project who were involved in the Wellcome LMIC Longitudinal Population Studies COVID-19 questionnaire design, and that's going to have some impact in Africa. But there are versions of that questionnaire that are in use in places like the UK as well. So we see that that's not a standard that we can ignore particularly. With the IDRC funding imminent, that would bring COVID-19 onto the table, but that bid is a very interesting one. I believe Henry Tonag has expressed interest in this group, Claire. He's involved with the bid that the IDRC is looking at, and he's done some very interesting work using surveillance and dashboard techniques based on AI and machine learning. And I'm not going to go into that. You should read the papers. Some of that work is very cool. It's very cross-cutting in terms of the way it accesses data sources and models them. Very intriguing, but we're looking at some very basic approaches to COVID-19 data and some very sophisticated ones for doing surveillance. And surveillance is becoming a big case for INSPIRE as a result of the addition of COVID-19 and particularly the work Henry is doing. So I think we have some pretty good use cases in INSPIRE for looking at different parts of this problem. When I look at what INSPIRE has to offer this kind of work, I think this slide sort of hits on some of these things. Aligning data models, not only for surveillance applications, but for the infrastructure, that is for repositories and registries and services, is very important. The OMOP CDM is a great data model. It's very, very flexible, very forgiving, but the implementation of it in INSPIRE indicates some of the data management aspects that are important. And one mistake that is often made with data collection instruments is that they don't think about the data management on the back end. And that can be, you can really shoot yourself in the foot that way. And so we see the alignment of data models for surveillance being aligned with the same models that we need for research and policy and infrastructure purposes as being a very important aspect of this work. And we feel like we have a lot of experience in that area that we can bring to the table. Another thing that we learn very quickly when you're looking at LMIC countries and in our case Africa, is you have to have something that can practically be implemented. And that means building on existing initiatives on the one hand, because you have things like the Welcome Questionnaire and the WHOCRF, but you also have to build on effective initiatives that are ongoing. And so when we look at Alpha and see the kind of data collection they're able to do in a practical way, we see solutions that we can apply to other problems. And I think that's critical because a lot of money has been dumped into Africa over the years that didn't produce sustainable solutions. And that's not something the funders are interested in. It's not something that a standard should build itself on. What we have to do is identify the best practice and build on the best practice. And I think INSPIRE gives us not only an example of that, but also connections to things like the African Open Science Platform and some of the collaborative efforts there and others that we can work from in doing sort of epidemiology and surveillance reporting, which I think is an important thing. So in conclusion, I think that a good standard for reporting this kind of surveillance data is a no-brainer, honestly. I don't think anybody is going to argue that you could get much more consistent, higher quality data as a result of it if we do it properly. And doing it properly will involve aligning it with some of the existing models and looking at what data sharing and reuse really means. And so that's very in line with the whole FAIR idea here. So from a CODATA perspective, from an Inspire perspective, this is right in line with the way we're thinking. And CODATA, obviously, from what Simon told us, strongly supports this work as part of the decadal program through Inspire, through Data Together. I think that operates at a bunch of different levels. I guess the cautionary note that I would sound here is that good standards are not academic top-down exercises. They're not about someone's brilliant idea. They're about formalizing best practice. And that means building on practical examples, looking at existing solutions, existing models, existing standards, and I think we have a lot of them in this space, and making something that works as part of that ecosystem. And so I think in conclusion, I certainly don't mean to be negative about this last point, but I do think that we have to be careful to work both top down and bottom up in a certain sense. And I think that Inspire gives us some of that bottom up element to work from and some examples of what's going on currently that we can build on. So so basically that's what I had to say, Claire. So I'm done. Thank you.
You're done, but you're not done. Thank you very, very much, Arofan. This is a really excellent overview and very, very encouraging for me and for Rajini. I couldn't agree with you more about well, pretty much all of what you said, but especially at the end, when you were saying that a standard is not an academic exercise. This isn't something that somebody sits down and theoretically works out the ideal standard and expects everybody to jump on board. Effective standards that are not only adopted but actually work, are consensus standards, and the only way you get a consensus standard is by getting all of the players around the table and hashing things out until they find something that they agree upon. The reason that they agree on it is because it works for everybody. Another thing that you said that stuck with me is that when you were talking about Inspire, you were saying that it's very ambitious. But at the same time, you're starting with something real. I think the same comment can be made about this case statement that we're going to take a look at. This is the objective, the task that this new RDA CODATA work group has set for itself is very, very ambitious. At the same time, we're starting with something that is real. And these days, there's nothing more real than COVID-19 data. And so while we're looking for development of a standard for reporting infectious disease surveillance data, we're starting with a use case. We're starting with a COVID-19 use case. And from there, when we can get a consensus and work out all of those hard bits, then find a way of generalizing that to another use case until we can say that we have a standard that we can put forth for infectious disease surveillance in general. Now, the time frame is not the objective is not only ambitious, but the time frame is very, very aggressive. 18 months. It's a very ambitious or aggressive time frame, and we may not get this this overarching generalizable surveillance data common or surveillance reporting common standard, but by working from a use case and building it up in a modular manner, we will have something that is usable and that, as you very rightly point out, also that it fits within what else is going on within as we collectively build a system that that works for everybody and that is accessible to everyone. So
Claire,
we have.
I'd
Go
like
ahead.
to respond to that if that's okay, because
Yeah.
I think that I was thinking a bit about the timelines here, and I am familiar with the RDA working group frame, and as you know, only last week CODATA agreed to sign on, which was happened quite quickly, shall we say?
Yeah.
But it does seem to me, and this was a comment that I heard some members of the first EPI group say, that RDA is set up to do very intense work, and it's not necessarily set up to sustain that work. And I know in the past, CODATA has worked with RDA to, in effect, implement things that work products coming out of RDA working groups, and to sort of maintain them, as it were, in light of those implementations. And I'm curious, based on what you just said, whether we might not take a similar approach here if it makes sense, which is to say, we do the work in an RDA frame, and we get to the 18-month point, and I think with what Simon said about the decadal program, it's pretty clear that we could do an implementation of what comes out of that group as part of the decadal program, or whatever makes sense, really. But that as a means of sustaining the work and taking it to wherever it needs to go to be really effective would make sense to me.
Yeah.
Of this is that these things can slow down when you start trying to build consensus and get adoption and implementing, right?
That's right. It has to go beyond the usual RDA 18-month. We're done. And while we're doing this work, we have to build not only capacity but sustainability for what happens beyond that. Steve, I think Steve, did you want to say something?
No, not specifically at this point. I mean, I've been working with Simon Arafan on the DDI CODATA collaboration as well. So I think it does certainly fit within that framework of where we've been heading in terms of the thinking as well. So yeah, I've just been sort of making my way through the case statement basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Double tasking, multitasking. Yeah. Rebecca, would you like to jump in?
As soon as I find my unmute button. No, I think it's really interesting. I think there's going to be a real challenge. Well, like you said, I agree with you. I mean, it's a very ambitious project, and a lot of people have started out, but you still have to have something to deliver in 18 months, even if you can't. I think it's a fantastic idea to look for where you could continue it and get support. But have you figured out what you would deliver at that 18 months? Because there's another alternative. The other alternative is to do an interest group. You still make use of the RDA resources, but you've just removed that 18-month deadline.
Yeah. So in my world, deadlines work magic.
I don't disagree with that, but you're going to get a lot of people to agree with that to move forward.
Yeah. So and the other, the other thing that we've built in, if you've had a chance, if you've been multitasking and reading ahead in the case statement also, we've come up with a draft, very simplified Gantt chart to give an idea how we're going to structure the work moving forward. And you see we built in a big chunk of time at the beginning to plan. So I want to avoid just sort of jumping in and saying, we know what needs to be done. We're going to build the standard. It's like we're just going to jump in and do it. I think that we would be shooting ourselves in the foot, even if we think we know what needs to be done. I'm sure all of us have pretty clear ideas about that. But to make it something that is actually going to be successful, that we can pass it off and it will be, taken up and used and take on a life of its own after we're done with it. We really need to take the time at the beginning to gather together people like yourself and Arafan and Simon and different organizations, stakeholders, to reach out and get these people on board, sitting around the table, the virtual table these days, and really figuring out what it is that is collectively needed, right? What is the collective need, and what do we really need to focus on, and take the time to analyze the problem. What is the problem really that we're trying to solve, and define our objectives very, very clearly. So I've built in a lot of time at the beginning to do that preparatory work, and with the belief that this will save time in the end, right? That although it shortens the time for the actual development of a standard, you're stealing months away from that. But I think that having that clarity going into it, that we will then know exactly what it is, where we're going, and we will have the various stakeholders and organizations on board, and that expertise and input, where us here on this call, for example, we all of us, I'm sure, have our blind spots, and so by I think the RDA is the ideal organization for bringing together these divergent, or diverse, I should say, diverse actors, some of which will diverge, and there will be divergence, and that's good. I want that. So because part of our work will be to resolve those divergences. If we can't resolve them within a consensus standard, then we won't have really achieved our goal.
Claire, I'd like to put an idea on the table, and this is something that we've done in the DDI Alliance. Steve watched this happen, which was basically a page we took out of the W3C's book. We were developing a specification, and it got to the point where we delivered something that was a draft of the specification, and it was by our calendar going to be put into production. And what we did was something that I think in W3C is often done as a regular part of their process, which is to put out a draft for implementation and not approve what they call a recommendation until the implementers have had a chance to make it work.
Right.
And so sometimes instead of delivering a quote production standard, what you deliver is an implementation draft, and you cut off just regular public comment, and you say, okay, now we're going to give this a certain amount of time for people to implement, and anything that comes out of that implementation is valid input back into the spec and can drive changes. The reason I mention that is because I'm not suggesting that we plan to do that up front necessarily, but that there are techniques like that for making sure that what you have in hand is in fact implementable. And I suspect that this, when I look at the timeline you're putting forward here, we might find ourselves in a situation where that becomes a good idea. So but we've done that to good effect in the DDI community. And what we ended up with, I think, was a much more implementable spec and much readier adoption as a result. So I think there are some tricks we could use. Although I do agree with your upfront planning. I think you need to take some time to socialize the ideas and talk to people for sure.
Right.
I think the other
I'd like to, Rosini, could you put the next, oh, sorry, can you stop sharing your screen, Arafan? Give it back to Rosini.
I thought I had done.
Oh, Rosini, can you put up the next slide after the talk?
Yes. Give me a minute. I think Steve had a comment, probably meanwhile if Steve wants to add up something.
Just a quick one, which was to say, I mean, the other thing that implementation draft process worked. I mean, we didn't meet the deadlines we set ourselves, and that's because what we were doing was complex as much as anything. But the other thing it did is it sort of, to the point of what are your, here are some ambitious timelines and what are you trying to achieve here? It provides an output, which, I mean, it's one way of thinking about how your deliverable might work, which is, to say, the end result of the working group is not a formalized standard. I think that might be, I'd say just looking at the content of what you're trying to cover, I think that's going to be challenging. But, as you say, kind of the implementation draft, as it were, is a formal output, deliverable in and of itself, that in a sense allows you to balance those time frame and potential content considerations in a more effective way. So it's quite a nice model of thinking. Then, all right, there is an end product here. It's not complete as a standard, but it is completed as a deliverable, and it sets up very nicely a next stage of work, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's all got to do with the upfront planning and scoping. To scope out, if we scope out what is the work that needs to be done. Okay, so we have a landscape of work that needs to be done. We can't do all of it. Okay, even if we had all of the stakeholders and even if we were funded, we could not address all of the issues that need to be addressed in a single standard with one group within 18 months. And so the idea is to scope out, understand the landscape, what work needs to be done, and then carve out the bit that it needs to be done most expeditiously, and that this type of a group can handle. And we could also, at the same time, scoping that out and identifying modules, let's say, or areas for work. There could also be, coming out of that initial work of this work group in the first 2 or 3 months, say, okay, well, this big chunk over here, our work group is not going to handle that, but it might spawn another work group or another forum that would then tackle that bit. But by having this discussion in this work group, then we would, and also, inserting ourselves in the CODATA decadal program, then we are bringing people together, and everyone's aware of what everyone else is doing, and there's this coordination that's going on, which would become, part of the activity in a sense. Although it's not the primary purpose of this working group to serve as a hub or a coordinating group, but because we're taking that time to do the planning and bringing people together, that would be one of the effects. We're going to run out of time, so I want to put all of this discussion at a higher level and bring to your attention, if you're not aware already, of the joint appeal for open science from UNESCO just 2 weeks ago, and I attended that. Virtually attended that meeting. And I almost literally fell off of my chair when I heard what was being said. This is the first time I have ever heard anyone say that data are a human right, that the access to data are the Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for the UN High Commission for Human Rights, stated, data are a vital human rights tool. And this joint appeal for open science is not open science in the sense of open access to publications, but science in all of its forms, so including the data and the computer code and the educational resources and so on, that this is a human right. And I wonder, I sort of imagine what impact that is going to have. I can only imagine that this is going to coming from the WHO, UNESCO, CERN, and the High Commission for Human Rights, that this is going to have a tremendous impact on what has been a movement. You know, the open science movement has been in existence now for a number of years, gaining momentum. You know, when I started in this, I felt very much like a missionary in a desert. But it has very rapidly picked up momentum, and more, you know, it is a thing now. The critical mass of scientists and organizations and funders and so on has been achieved. And so this work that we're proposing in the RDA is very, very much in this context. And I think that given this joint appeal that has just come out, that is going to strengthen and support this work also.
This is interesting, Claire, because there's actually a panel. Steve knows all about this, I think, probably, in the Convergence Symposium that Simon talked about. There's a fellow named George Alter, who Steve and I have worked with in a DDI context for some years, but he's organizing a session about data provenance. And when you parse this statement from this joint statement, what it really begs you to understand is a complete picture of data provenance. It gets to this fairer idea where reproducibility and machine actionable and reproducible understanding of data is actually what's being described here. And
That's right.
I think that session at the Convergence Symposium we expect there to be a fair amount of attention in that area, partly because of exactly what you're seeing here, is that we're not just talking about a publication now. You need to know more than what's in the article. You need to understand what's behind it and what produced that data, and what increasingly what computers, what automated resources in an age of artificial intelligence, what did you apply to this? What black box did you feed your data to? And I think you get into biosamples and you get into all kinds of stuff in this picture almost immediately. I think that's an area that I know from talking to Simon, he sees the decadal program as having to address that area. And I think it is very much based on this kind of thinking. Although I've never heard him reference this specifically, but I know that he's aware of this work, certainly. But I do think.
And this is.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Rebecca. Did you want to say something? I'm hearing an echo, so it's not. I'm never sure who's trying to talk.
Not me.
Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah. So you know, but to have this, you know, data, scientific data as a human right, I mean, this just presupposes so much. It's not just the data. The data need to be usable. They need to be documented. They need to be all of the things that we know that they should be, and that they are not often. And this is why we're talking in this working group not only about fair data, but about fairer data, ethical and reproducible. So everything that goes along with that. I'd like Rajini to move us on to the next slide, and actually maybe skip that slide because it's more of the same. Rajini, if you could go on to slide number.
I'm on the charter. Do you see that slide? I'm not sure because I have two web pages open now. So what do you see?
No, is the audio? Yeah, the audio is okay.
No, do you see the charter?
I'm seeing
slide?
the charter, an aligned framework slide.
Yes, that's what I meant to show.
Right.
Thank you.
So, Rajini, could you? We have like 12 minutes left, and could you sort of guide people through and try and get a sense of where they would like us to focus in editing or improving the charter, not the charter, but the case statement?
Yeah, sure. So for the next 10 to 11 minutes that I see that we have, I would ask you all to to open this case statement Google Doc, which I shared a few minutes ago on the chat, and the snippets from these case statement are in this presentation. And if I may ask you all, if we would like to go through this next 10 to 11 minutes on the parts of these case statements, for example, beginning with charter, or if you want to go ahead, we could discuss what changes do you all suggest, or you have any comments on.
I'm going to have issues with the Google Doc, Rajni, but a couple of comments right out. I have anecdotally heard from people who were part of the EPI group some very specific things that were mentioned. When you talk about the work begun by the COVID-19 epidemiology working group, it seemed to me that some of the specifics around VODAN and around OMOP and around some of these other standards could usefully be incorporated directly in there. I think those are important details, especially because you're going to be talking about building upon existing standards, and that begins to guide you in that direction. I did feel like there was some good, I don't know that it was published as part of the output of that group, but it came out of the work of that group. And I think it would be a shame not to carry that forward. The person I would suggest we talk to about this maybe first would be Jay Greenfield, honestly, because I think he had a very strong sense of how the initial round of work would impact some of the follow-on from a standards perspective. So
Yeah, but I agree with you. Big echo. Yeah, so the work that you're referring to, Jay's work and Ali's work, was published in the. It absolutely was published. There were. It was not in the recommendations and guidelines, the overarching recommendations and guidelines that was published on June 30th. But the EPI group was the only subwork group that published supporting output. We had 7 different supporting outputs, right. 3 of which were the work that you're referring to. So there was EpiStack, EpiTrack. EpiStack was built on the OMOP that you're referring to, the Common Data Model.
Yep.
Yeah, and so that we have included that in the case statement. Also VODAN.
Okay.
That's.
I was just concerned that not get lost, Claire, because I read those documents at Jay's prompting, and I thought that was very good work, and it would be a shame not to showcase that for sure.
Yeah, so that was published as an official supporting RDA supporting output, absolutely, so we're all good there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, go ahead, Rajini.
Any other comments that specifically pertain to charter? Okay, if not, then I proceed to the other slides. Okay, with the value proposition, also we have discussed the audiences or the stakeholders that would be benefited out of this common standard. And yes, anything specific if anybody has to talk about the engagement with the existing work. So probably here your comment, Arofan, can also be taken into consideration, yes. So I think Claire was in touch with Jay Greenfield, if I remember. So we have touched upon his comments in the engagement with existing work, right, Claire?
Yes, that's correct. That work is cited in the case statement presently.
Okay. So if
now, just to to respond more completely to Arfan's comment, the OMAP is not, we haven't fleshed that out in the case statement, nor VODAN. So it's cited. My feeling was that this was something that would be discussed more fully, very early on at the beginning of the work, but perhaps there is room to bring in a more complete description of what that entails.
I'm not insistent, Claire, about that. I do think that it's going to be important in terms of the discussion, and I'm happy
Right.
if that's where it lives. Depending on what you're trying to do with the case statement, I think people might be interested to see it there. I'm like I say, I don't have a hard opinion about that. I just felt that there was a lot of goodness there that we needed to retain, basically.
Yeah. It's being retained. Don't worry.
Yeah, no. But I mean, footnoting it is one thing. Mentioning it maybe is a good idea. I leave that up to you, really. I'm not.
Okay. All right.
I'm not insistent. I just I'm reassured that that's something that's on the table, really.
Okay. Go ahead, Rojini.
Okay, so I would just rush directly to the work plan, considering we just have now 5 more minutes. And yes, to the most important part, I would directly rush a little bit to milestones. Did I miss? Did I miss the milestones slide, Claire?
Would be slide number 19.
Yes. Yes, so yeah, just to draw your attention that this is the simplified Gantt chart, and what Claire spoke about, the aggressive timelines and the deliverables that we have in this Gantt chart in terms of what we would like to deliver. So majorly to have the common standard prepared for the initial first to develop, use the COVID-19 data as a use case, and then to develop the common standards, and finally with the guidelines. But of course, we also look at the activities such as the hackathon and to develop, to have the public review of the draft standard and so on. So Claire, would you like to detail on hackathon a little?
Right. So a hackathon, I think, is a bit unusual for an RDA work group. The thinking right now, and I'm very open to any other ideas, but to get a handle on things and to be really very practical, I was thinking one idea could be, the objective would be to perhaps combine publicly available COVID-19 related data sets and to identify the issues and present solutions that would overcome some of the barriers that we know will be encountered. So I would organize, again, it's a very aggressive timeline. I've been involved in the organization of a few hackathons, and I think that in this case, it would be advantageous to have an open hackathon. In other words, the problem presented in advance of the next plenary, so that people can work on it for a month or more in advance, and then have the usual hackathon experience at the plenary. One thing that my experience with hackathons is that the days of getting students and grad students really excited and geared up about winning a prize at a hackathon is that these days you actually have to pay. And so the one that we did at the IEEE when I surveyed the participants, and another very big one that we did nationally in Canada, and I asked them, so what is the most valuable prize for you? And there were two things. One was money, and the other was co-authorship on a paper coming out of the hackathon. And this is what I would propose for this hackathon. But then the way the RDA works, I'm wondering if you would have some ideas in the next minute about how we could seek funding for prizes for a hackathon.
I actually, Claire, I'm of two minds about hackathons because I feel like they do an immediate short-term road test to determine the viability of something in a good way. I think that, and I don't know where we get the money to pay these people, but that's something we can think about.
Right.
What we've found in developing standards is that having implementers agree up front that they will take drafts of the specs. We did this with DDI cross-domain integration spec. And in fact, Inspire was one of the implementers. Having actual projects doing longer term implementation of the drafts on an understanding that the end product will support their needs is a necessary complement. A hackathon is a very quick validation. An actual implementation, I think we should roll into the plan if we're interested in that. And I think Inspire is maybe one place where we could look at that. But maybe there are others who we could recruit in other contexts. I would really suggest beefing up that part of this. Hackathons are nice, but they're no better than nice, in my opinion.
So in this case, what we're proposing in this case is a hackathon at the beginning.
Right.
Basically,
Sure.
to accelerate. So we're not doing a hackathon to test implementation of anything at all because we won't have developed anything yet.
No, you're just exploring.
Accelerate the exploration work, right? So getting.
No, I'm not challenging. I'm not challenging where you're putting it. I think that's the appropriate place because I think it is a viability and an accelerant, right? But what I'm saying is I think that we should probably think about further downstream doing some implementation validation because I think that feedback is critical. And it may be that something that's a hackathon in the first instance can grow into that role, I guess is kind of what I have in the back of my head. At which point you don't really have to give them prizes. You just tell them, well, you get the spec you can use at the end of the day. But you know, so that maybe is a slightly different take on it. But I do think that kind of implementation track is really important. And maybe where you have a hackathon becomes the beginning of that kind of a process is kind of what I'm thinking. So
yeah, you're right. Okay, so we're going to, it's 8:32, and we're going, this has been a really, really good conversation, and I hope that you all will continue looking at the case statement in the Google Doc. It's going to stay open, so please go to it with your red pen, your virtual red pen in the Google Doc. Rajini, could you go to the very last slide, slide number 31?
Yes, I'm now in slide 31. Do you see that?
Yes. So the motivation for doing this really is the motivation I think that pretty much everybody has in the RDA activities. It's to make a difference. So first, we need to believe that we can and that we will make a difference. One of the things I very much admire of the executive director of the RDA is that, you know, when I see her in action, really there are no problems, there are only solutions. And so in this case, COVID-19, which we'll be using as a use case, really, you know, that i.e. humanity, we can find and we can build these solutions that will get us past COVID-19 and prevent future such catastrophes. And I think that's really a very important motivation for a common standard. Is that without a common standard and using still living with antiquated systems, we were not in a position to have early detection and rapid response. And so this work will contribute to future early detection and rapid response. The question is not can we do it, but will we do it? And I firmly believe that we will. I really do. And with that, I'm going to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart participating, and all of those future people who will be listening to this recording. And looking forward to talking with you again. And please feel free to reach out and contact either Rajini or myself to continue the discussion. Thank you very, very much, and good evening, everybody.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Rajini.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. It was a very enjoyable session. Thank you.
Thank you.